Most of us believe we choose our food. We imagine ourselves moving through supermarket aisles as independent decision makers, comparing labels, weighing options, selecting what seems healthiest or tastiest or most affordable. But what if this sense of autonomy is largely an illusion? What if the foods we reach for, the diets we follow, and even the expert advice we trust have been shaped quietly, strategically, and relentlessly by powerful actors whose interests rarely align with our health? In the United States, food is not just nourishment, it is business, it is politics, it is power. And behind every bite lies a hidden story. This book begins with a paradox. A nation that once struggled with hunger now struggles with abundance, yet its dietary advice has never fully reflected this shift. For more than a century, Americans have been pushed to eat more meat, more dairy, more sugar, more packaged foods. When science finally sounded the alarm, warning that the very products promoted as symbols of prosperity were fueling epidemics of heart disease, diabetes, and obesity, the backlash from industry was swift, fierce, and expertly coordinated. What followed was not a debate about nutrition, it was a battle for economic survival. Inside these pages, you will travel through congressional back rooms where lobbyists rewrite scientific guidelines before they reach the public. You will see how the dairy industry convinced schools to serve children milk at every meal, how cereal companies smuggled sugar into healthy breakfast campaigns, and how soda giants funded scientists to shift blame away from sugary drinks and onto exercise. You will watch as front groups masquerading as consumer advocates attack researchers who dare to question industry narratives. And you will see how subtle alliances, grants, partnerships, sponsorships allowed corporations to wrap themselves in the prestige of health institutions, turning critics into supporters and skepticism into silence. This is not simply a story about food. It is a story about influence, about how dietary advice is negotiated, softened, rewritten, and reshaped before it ever reaches your table. About how billion-dollar industries learn to weaponize science, public relations, law, and politics. About how eat less became the most controversial sentence in American nutrition. This book does not ask you to fear food. It asks you to understand power. Because until we confront the forces that shape our choices, we cannot fully understand why our plates look the way they do, or why, despite decades of warnings, the diseases linked to diet continue to climb. The story of American food is the story of a system designed to persuade, protect, and profit. It is the story of how science battles politics, how truth battles influence, and how public health battles the economic machinery of an entire nation. Welcome to Food Politics. The fight for your plate begins here. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was a country struggling with problems that appear almost inverted when compared to those of the present day. Instead of worrying about obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, Americans faced hunger, undernutrition, and the physical exhaustion that came from long hours of manual labor. The nutritional landscape of 1900 was shaped by the realities of industrialization, poverty, and limited food access. A typical urban worker, especially an immigrant or a laborer in steel or textile plants, performed physically demanding tasks for 10 to 12 hours a day. Calories, not balance, were the priority. For rural families who produced their own food, diets were highly seasonal and monotonous. Fresh fruits, vegetables, or proteins were luxuries tied to weather, harvest cycles, or local availability. Diseases caused by nutrient deficiencies, rickets, pellagra, goiter, and scurvy, were widespread. In such a context, it is unsurprising that early nutritional advice centered on the idea that Americans needed to eat more, not less. Nutrition as a scientific field was still in its infancy. Wilbur Olin Atwater, considered the earliest American authority on dietary science, provided calorie tables and advised that workers needed large amounts of protein and fats to sustain heavy labor. But early advice often reflected cultural assumptions as much as scientific truth. Meat was equated with strength, masculinity, and health. Bread, especially white bread, signaled progress and cleanliness. Sugar was marketed as quick energy, long before scientists understood its metabolic consequences. For many Americans, These messages were not merely scientific, they were aspirational, reflecting a desire to escape the poverty and scarcity that had defined life for generations. Government involvement in food policy grew during this period as well, but it was shaped less by public health concerns than by agricultural politics. Farmers wielded considerable power in Congress, and the federal government saw its responsibility as both supporting rural economies and ensuring national stability. Encouraging Americans to consume more dairy, grains, and meat aligned perfectly with agricultural interests. This synergy between government, agriculture, and emerging nutritional science laid the foundation for a century-long relationship in which dietary advice would be influenced not only by what was healthy, but by what was economically desirable. The First World War pushed these connections into national consciousness. Herbert Hoover, leading the U.S. Food Administration, initiated one of the earliest large-scale food education campaigns in American history. Posters urged citizens to modify their diets for patriotic reasons. Eat more corn, save the sugar, eat fish on Tuesdays. These wartime slogans were not driven by nutritional evidence, but by logistical need. Wheat was required for soldiers, corn was abundant at home. For millions of Americans, this was their first exposure to national dietary guidance, and it taught a lesson that never fully disappeared. Changing what you eat could serve the nation. When the war ended, food companies quickly realized the persuasive power of these messages. If patriotism could convince people to consume more, then advertising could keep them consuming indefinitely. Thus began the rise of industrial food marketing. As canning technology improved and national distribution networks expanded, producers faced a new challenge, not scarcity, but surplus. Food companies needed Americans to eat more simply to absorb increased production. Sugar refiners encouraged desserts and sweetened beverages. Bread companies promoted sliced white bread as the hallmark of modern life. Cereal manufacturers used health claims and cartoon mascots to appeal to children. Meat producers insisted that a real meal required beef. Nutrition, advertising, and cultural identity became intertwined, reinforcing the message that eating more was both healthy and desirable. Public health messaging during the 1920s and 1930s often reflected these industry interests. Milk, which genuinely helped prevent child malnutrition, was promoted relentlessly by dairy companies that doubled the recommended intake to levels far beyond necessity. Meat boards portrayed plant-based diets as inadequate or even dangerous. White bread was advertised as superior to whole grains, supported by nutrition experts who relied on industry-funded research. The line between scientific advice and commercial promotion blurred so thoroughly that most consumers could not distinguish one from the other. Meanwhile, the expectations placed on women amplified these campaigns. As the primary household food decision-makers, women were targeted by enormous volumes of advertising disguised as nutritional guidance. Cookbooks produced by food companies promoted high usage of sugar, flour, canned goods, and processed items. Magazines published charts and expert opinions equating good motherhood with abundant meals, more dishes, larger portions, richer ingredients. Food corporations taught women how to cook in ways that increased dependency on branded products. As a result, American eating habits were shaped not merely by science or policy, but by gender roles and the commercialization of domestic life. The Great Depression disrupted this trajectory. Economic collapse brought hunger back into the American household on a scale not seen in decades. Food scarcity became widespread, unemployment soared, and malnutrition reemerged. The government responded with the first major food assistance programs, surplus food distribution, early food stamps, and school lunch pilots. These initiatives had dual goals, alleviating hunger and supporting agricultural markets. The government bought surplus butter, cheese, apples, pork, and grains from struggling farmers and distributed them to the poor. In doing so, it reinforced the idea that certain foods, especially meat, dairy, and wheat products, were essential, even when the scientific rationale was not fully established. By the end of the 1930s, the United States had cemented a national food identity based on abundance. Eating more was not only acceptable, it was patriotic, scientific, and economically beneficial. Food companies advertised larger portions as signs of prosperity. Public health officials emphasized calories for strength. The government validated high consumption through agricultural support policies. Everything, science, politics, culture, industry, aligned to encourage Americans to eat more. This early mindset would have profound consequences for the nation. When scientific evidence later emerged linking diet to chronic disease, the shift from eat more to eat less collided head-on with decades of cultural conditioning and commercial interests. But that struggle belonged to later decades. For now, in the first third of the 20th century, the path was clear. America was building a food system and a national identity on the foundation of eating more. The close of the 1930s marked a turning point in the American relationship with food. With the Great Depression still casting a long shadow, the United States was forced to confront the tension between persistent hunger and the growing agricultural surpluses produced by an increasingly mechanized farming system. This paradox, simultaneous scarcity for consumers and abundance for producers, created fertile ground for policies and industry practices that intensified the national eat more ideology. It was during this period that American dietary advice became in separate government intervention in the 1930s grew out of necessity. Farmers were producing more than the market could absorb, not because demand was high, but because mechanization, fertilizers, and improved seed varieties dramatically increased yields. Wheat output rose sharply. Dairy farms produced more milk and butter than consumers could afford. Pork production climbed even as prices collapsed. In 1933, hog prices plummeted to just a few cents per pound, far too low for farmers to survive. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, in AAA, responded with drastic measures, including the infamous hog reduction program, which slaughtered more than 6 million pigs to stabilize prices. Public outrage forced the government to find more politically acceptable solutions, and it turned to food distribution as a way to reduce surplus while supporting struggling Americans. This shift gave rise to some of the earliest large-scale government food programs. In 1936, the federal government purchased surplus butter from dairy producers and distributed it to poor families. Between 1935 and 1939, the government acquired roughly 1.5 billion pounds of surplus food, including cheese, apples, beans, canned meats, and flour. The purpose was officially humanitarian, but the underlying motivation was to prop up agricultural prices. As Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace later admitted, these programs were as much about saving farmers as feeding the hungry. The implementation of school lunch programs further solidified the government's dual role. While early pilots in the 1930s varied by state, they consistently served foods tied to agricultural surpluses. Children were given whole milk, buttered bread, peanut butter sandwiches, pork stew, and canned fruits. Nutrition was a consideration, but so was the requirement to absorb excess production. A 1939 report from the USDA explicitly stated that the school lunch program should utilize surplus commodities in a manner beneficial both to child health and agricultural stability. This was one of the clearest early acknowledgments that federal food policy operated at the intersection of public welfare and economic necessity. Food companies eagerly embraced this environment. The dairy industry, recognizing that government purchases strengthened their market position, launched campaigns that aligned closely with federal messaging. The National Dairy Council, established in 1915 but becoming especially powerful in the 1930s, distributed educational pamphlets claiming children needed a full quart of milk per day, a recommendation far exceeding physiological requirements. These pamphlets, often sent directly to schools, were disguised as scientific material. One widely circulated booklet titled Milk, the Master Food, asserted that milk prevented fatigue, improved school performance, and ensured robust Americanized growth, linking dairy consumption not only to health but to national identity. The grain industry followed similar strategies. White bread manufacturers, including major players like Continental Baking Company, promoted sliced white bread as a hallmark of modern cleanliness and efficiency. Their advertising claimed that refined white flour was pure because it had been stripped of impurities, the very bran and germ that contained valuable nutrients. In 1930, The company's Wonder Bread campaign introduced the slogan, "Builds strong bodies," long before fortification made any scientific sense. This messaging was designed to create dependency. Mothers were told that serving white bread was a sign of good parenting, cleanliness, and modernity. Sugar refiners were no less aggressive. The Sugar Institute, funded by major refiners, produced educational materials asserting that sugar was essential for quick energy, especially for children and laborers. In 1934, a children's pamphlet titled "The Story of Sugar" claimed that sugar helped students concentrate and gave strength for play, despite emerging scientific concerns that excessive sugar intake contributed to tooth decay. These pamphlets were distributed in thousands of public schools, shaping perceptions of sugar as a beneficial nutrient rather than an indulgence. Meat producers also emphasized quantity over balance. The American Meat Institute, founded in 1906, used the economic hardships of the Great Depression to promote meat as a source of resilience. Advertisements suggested that consuming beef was vital for strength during difficult times. One campaign from 1933 declared, "Strong men eat meat," reinforcing cultural associations between masculinity and high-protein diets. Women, too, were targeted. Magazines promoted meat-based meals as signs of a capable, caring homemaker who ensured her family's vigor despite economic hardship. These industry efforts were amplified by technological advances and the rise of national mass media. Radio advertising exploded in the 1930s, reaching millions of households. Food companies sponsored programs aimed at homemakers, such as the Betty Crocker Cooking Show, which taught listeners recipes that increased usage of branded flour, baking mixes, and canned goods. These programs presented themselves as educational, yet their purpose was overtly commercial. They sought to reshape the American palate around processed ingredients that could be mass-produced and distributed nationally. Another critical development during this period was the emergence of fortified foods. Although fortification did not become widespread until the 1940s, the groundwork was laid in the late 1930s. Nutrition scientists had discovered vitamins A, B, C, D, and E, and they increasingly linked nutrient deficiencies to health problems. Industry saw an opportunity. By adding small amounts of vitamins to processed foods, companies could market products as scientifically improved, even if the underlying nutritional quality remained poor. This strategy would later explode in the post-war era, but its roots were already visible by 1938. Cereal companies like Kellogg's began discussing vitamin enrichment as a way to recast sugary cereals as health-promoting products. The American public, meanwhile, internalized the abundance mindset. Large portions became a sign of prosperity. Serving multiple dishes, meat, potatoes, bread, dessert, became a marker of good parenting and middle-class respectability. When sociologists conducted household interviews in 1937, many families equated full plates with emotional comfort and moral satisfaction. Eating well meant eating plenty, and eating plenty meant eating the foods industries promoted most aggressively: milk, meat, bread, sugar, and processed staples. By the end of the decade, the foundation for modern food politics had been laid. Scientific expertise, government policy, industry marketing, and cultural norms all pointed toward the same conclusion. Americans should eat more, and specifically they should eat more of the foods produced by powerful agricultural and industrial interests. Not only did this shape dietary habits for generations, but it also created a political ecosystem in which advising Americans to eat less would later provoke fierce resistance. The United States entered the 1940s with this ideology firmly entrenched. The coming decades would bring war, technological revolution, and groundbreaking scientific discoveries about chronic disease. But none of these developments would erase the momentum of the early 20th century. Instead, they would collide with it, setting the stage for one of the most consequential nutritional battles of the modern era. The decades following World War II fundamentally reshaped the American food system and transformed national eating habits in ways that neither early nutrition scientists nor policymakers could have anticipated. While the pre-war era established the cultural and political foundations of the Eat More doctrine, The post-war period expanded that doctrine into a full-scale national ideology supported by economic growth, technological innovation, corporate consolidation, and an unprecedented explosion of agricultural productivity. At the same time, a new problem quietly emerged: chronic disease linked not to scarcity, but to abundance. This era marked the beginning of America's long struggle to reconcile economic incentives that encouraged increased consumption with scientific evidence suggesting that such consumption carried serious health risks. As World War II began, the U.S. government once again mobilized the nation's dietary habits for military purposes. Rationing systems were introduced for sugar, meat, butter, canned goods, and cooking fats. The Office of Price Administration, OPA, regulated food distribution, while the War Food Administration promoted meals that conserved critical resources like meat and wheat for soldiers overseas. Yet even here, the government maintained the familiar pattern of encouraging calorie sufficiency. Nutrition pamphlets emphasized eating enough to maintain strength for labor, productivity, and national morale. Posters from 1943 showed women in factories with the slogan, "You need energy, eat well, and do your part," reinforcing the notion that food was a weapon of war and that eating enough was a patriotic duty. But the end of the war brought a dramatic shift, with soldiers returning home, industries retooling for civilian production, and wartime technologies adapting to peacetime use. The United States unleashed a wave of agricultural and industrial expansion unprecedented in scale. Mechanization accelerated across the country. Tractors replaced animal labor. Chemical fertilizers developed during the war were repurposed for farming. Hybrid seeds multiplied yields. Irrigation expanded across the Midwest and California. By 1955, U.S. corn production had more than doubled compared to pre-war levels. Wheat, soy, dairy, and livestock sectors saw similar gains. America had entered the age of surplus farming, and the problem was no longer how to feed the nation. It was how to sell the nation more food than it needed. This massive increase in agricultural productivity created a profound economic pressure. If Americans did not consume more, prices would collapse and farm incomes would plummet. The Eisenhower administration, faced with overflowing grain bins and milk storage tanks, introduced new policies to support farmers, including price supports, surplus purchases, and export programs. But these measures had unintended consequences. They tied agricultural stability to ever-increasing consumption, cementing the political need for Americans to eat more, even as scientific evidence began to suggest the opposite. Food companies capitalized on the abundance by innovating aggressively. Processing technologies that had been refined during the war, dehydration, canning, freezing, emulsification, were adapted to create new consumer products. The rise of supermarkets in the 1940s and 1950s provided the perfect distribution channel. Instead of purchasing food from local stores or butchers, Americans now shopped in brightly lit aisles lined with packaged branded foods. Supermarkets encouraged bulk buying, impulse purchases, and the idea that convenience was a modern virtue. Between 1945 and 1960, the number of supermarkets in the U.S. increased from roughly 17,000 to over 50,000, transforming not only how Americans purchased food, but how they perceived it. Advertising reinforced this shift. Food companies produced glamorous television commercials showing housewives serving gelatin molds, casseroles, processed cheese slices, colorful cereals, and frozen TV dinners. These products were framed as symbols of modernity, efficiency, and middle-class success. One iconic 1950s Swanson advertisement presented the TV dinner as a revolutionary invention that freed women from hours in the kitchen, declaring, "You can enjoy more leisure time, the modern way to serve dinner." In less than a decade, processed convenience foods became fixtures in American households. At the same time, agricultural surpluses drove government policies that further shaped national diets. The National School Lunch Act of 1946, signed by President Truman, was explicitly designed to absorb agricultural excess. Although framed as a public health program, its legislative text stated that it existed to encourage the domestic consumption of nutritious agricultural commodities. School menus reflected this political objective. Milk was served daily, cheese appeared in sandwiches and casseroles, and hot lunches frequently included surplus beef, pork, and wheat products. By 1960, over 20 million children participated in the program, making it one of the largest coordinated food delivery systems in the country. The foods children grew up eating in schools became the foods they associated with normal American meals, reinforcing the place of meat, dairy, refined grains, and processed foods in the national consciousness. Food companies, meanwhile, continued shaping perceptions of what a proper diet looked like. The dairy. Industry intensified its messaging, pushing children to drink more milk, often at least 2 glasses per meal. In the 1950s, the American Dairy Association ran a television campaign claiming that milk was nature's perfect food, a phrase still echoed today despite its dubious scientific grounding. The cereal industry used television to reach children directly. Kellogg's introduced characters like Tony the Tiger in 1952 to promote Frosted Flakes, blending entertainment and marketing in a way that made sugary cereals a staple of the American breakfast. These campaigns were extraordinarily effective. By 1965, per capita sugar consumption had risen to nearly 100 pounds per year, much of it hidden in processed foods. Yet while the food system thrived economically, a new kind of health problem emerged, one linked not to underconsumption but to overconsumption. Heart disease rates rose sharply after the 1940s, becoming the leading cause of death by the early 1950s. Obesity rates, while far lower than today, began to climb. Studies from Framingham and other research centers identified correlations between diet, cholesterol, and chronic illness. Nutrition scientists like Ansel Keys argued that saturated fat contributed to heart disease and that Americans needed to reduce their intake of meat, dairy, and processed foods. Keys' work on the 7 countries study, initiated in 1958, highlighted the dietary patterns of Mediterranean populations, whose lower rates of chronic disease contrasted sharply with the heavy, meat-centered American diet. However, these scientific findings met immediate resistance from powerful food industries. The meat, dairy, and processed food sectors rejected claims that their products might be contributing to disease. Industry-funded scientists produced counter-studies that questioned the connection between saturated fat and heart disease, sowing confusion among policymakers and the public. The Sugar Research Foundation, now the Sugar Association, funded a 1967 review in the New England Journal of Medicine that downplayed sugar's role in heart disease and placed the blame squarely on fat. This controversial intervention shaped dietary guidelines for decades. Government policy remained closely tied to agricultural interests. Export programs expanded. Surplus grains were sent abroad under initiatives like the Food for Peace program, Public Law 480, launched in 1954. Domestically, the government continued purchasing surplus dairy and grain, stabilizing prices and encouraging production. Rather than reducing overproduction, policymakers doubled down on it. The entire system, farm bills, subsidies, corporate marketing, school lunch programs, advertising, reinforced the idea that Americans should eat more, even as science increasingly suggested that eating less of certain foods might be necessary for health. Culturally, the post-war ideal of abundance became deeply ingrained. Large portions symbolized hospitality and prosperity. Holiday meals featured excess as a point of pride. Families celebrated with casseroles overflowing with cheese, butter, and canned soup. Restaurants offered all-you-can-eat buffets. Fast food chains like McDonald's, founded in 1940, expanded rapidly in the 1950s and 1960s, promoting speed, affordability, and indulgence. By 1968, the Big Mac had been introduced, accompanied by marketing that celebrated indulgence as a quintessentially American pleasure. This created a profound contradiction. The more scientists warned about diet-related diseases, the more the political and economic structures encouraged greater consumption. Public health officials struggled to communicate risk without directly challenging the industries that supplied America's food. As chronic disease rates continued rising, the stage was set for the most consequential dietary conflict in U.S. history, the transition from eat more to eat less. By the early 1970s, the United States had entered a new nutritional era, one marked by a profound and unavoidable contradiction. After nearly 7 decades of being told to eat more, Americans were now confronted with scientific evidence suggesting that the country's most cherished foods, meat, milk, sugar, and processed products, were contributing to an escalating crisis of chronic disease. Heart disease, obesity, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes were no longer rare. They had become central public health concerns. The nation that once struggled with deficiency now struggled with excess. This reversal placed nutrition science in direct opposition to the political, cultural, and commercial forces that had shaped American eating habits throughout the 20th century. For the first time, large segments of the scientific community began to argue that Americans needed to consume less fat, less saturated fat, less sugar, fewer calories, less processed food, and less meat. But the industries built on those very foods were powerful, politically connected, and deeply woven into the nation's economic fabric. As a result, the push toward eat less triggered one of the most contentious periods in U.S. food policy history. The scientific alarm bell rings. In 1961, the American Heart Association, AHA, publicly linked saturated fat and cholesterol to heart disease. This marked a turning point. The connection between diet and chronic illness was no longer speculative. It was gaining institutional legitimacy. The famous Framingham Heart Study, launched in 1948, had begun producing long-term data showing correlations between dietary patterns and heart disease. By the late 1960s, nutrition researchers like Ansel Keys, Jeremiah Stamler, and Mark Hegsted were pointing to patterns that contradicted traditional American eating habits. Their findings challenged deeply held assumptions. Americans had been taught that red meat was strength, dairy was purity, bread was progress, and sugar was energy. Now these foods were appearing in studies as contributors to long-term disease risk. The dietary guidelines that had been constructed around abundance were being dismantled by science, piece by piece. The McGovern Committee, the first attempt at Eat Less. In 1977, the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, chaired by Senator George McGovern, released the first federal attempt to create dietary goals for the nation. These dietary goals for the United States were revolutionary. For the first time, a government document explicitly suggested that Americans reduce their intake of certain foods. The original 1977 recommendations included reduce saturated fat consumption by approximately 50%, decrease consumption of butterfat, eggs, and other high cholesterol foods, reduce sugar consumption by about 40%, decrease meat consumption, increase poultry and fish, increase consumption of fruits and vegetables. These statements appear ordinary today, but in 1977 they were explosive. For the first time, a federal institution had acknowledged what scientists had been arguing. The American diet contained too much of the foods that industry depended on. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Industry strikes back. Food industries mobilized in ways never seen before. The meat industry, the National Cattlemen's Association, accused the committee of attempting to destroy American agriculture. They demanded that the phrase "reduce meat consumption" be removed. Their pressure worked. The language was replaced with the more ambiguous "choose meats, poultry, and fish that will reduce saturated fat intake." The direct instruction to eat less meat was gone. The egg industry. The American Egg Board argued that warnings about cholesterol were based on unproven science. They poured money into public relations campaigns that reframed eggs as a misunderstood food. The sugar industry. Perhaps the most aggressive response came from sugar refiners. They insisted that sugar was vital for energy and dismissed research linking sugar to chronic disease. The Sugar Association had already funded a 1967 NEJM review that misrepresented evidence by shifting blame to fat, and now they doubled down on asserting that sugar reduction was unnecessary. The dairy industry milk producers argued that recommending reductions in saturated fat would endanger children. They warned Congress that the committee's goals could collapse dairy markets, a politically powerful claim in farm states. Within months, The McGovern Committee's bold language had been softened, diluted, and in key places completely reversed. The science was clear, but the politics were louder. Food companies embrace a new strategy, the low-fat mirage. Realizing that outright denial of scientific findings might not be sustainable, companies pivoted. If Americans were going to demand healthier foods, corporations would provide them on their own terms. The 1980s saw the birth of the low-fat and fat-free craze. Food companies reformulated products to remove fat and replace it with sugar, stabilizers, and artificial flavors. Snackwell's fat-free cookies became a national sensation, selling out in supermarkets across the country. Frozen dinners, yogurts, salad dressings, and baked goods were rebranded as low-fat alternatives. Americans were led to believe that eating low-fat versions of the same processed foods would make them healthier. But reducing fat often required adding more sugar and refined carbohydrates, inadvertently contributing to the next wave of health problems. By 1990, per capita sugar consumption had risen to over 120 pounds per year, despite decades of warnings. Obesity rates climbed steadily. The low-fat movement had solved nothing, but it had protected industry profits. The USDA takes over nutrition guidelines, 1980. In 1980, federal dietary guidelines were transferred from the scientific community to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the same institution responsible for promoting agricultural products. This represented a profound structural conflict of interest. The agency tasked with encouraging Americans to eat healthier was the same agency tasked with promoting the consumption of U.S. meat, dairy, wheat, and other agricultural goods. As a result, guidelines avoided calling out specific foods. Language favored vague terms like choose wisely, moderate, and balance. Industry influence ensured that the core message remained, eat more of our products. The 1980 guidelines reflected these tensions. They acknowledged the need to reduce fat and sugar, but they did so cautiously. The phrase eating less meat was replaced by statements about lean choices. Sugar was framed as something to consume in moderation, not something to reduce dramatically. Scientists viewed these guidelines as watered down. Industries viewed them as acceptable. The public viewed them as confusing. The rise of chronic disease. Metrics. By the late 1980s, data on chronic disease had reached alarming levels. Heart disease remained the #1 killer in the U.S. Adult obesity had doubled since 1960. Type 2 diabetes was rising rapidly. Hypertension and stroke were increasingly linked to diet. The medical community continued urging reductions in saturated fat, sodium, sugar, and calories. But political and commercial pressures kept guidelines mild and industry-friendly. Fast food, portion inflation, and the culture of abundance. While scientists, politicians, and lobbyists fought over dietary guidelines, American eating habits changed dramatically in the marketplace. Fast food chains, McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, KFC, Pizza Hut, expanded aggressively. Their portions grew steadily larger. McDonald's introduced the Quarter Pounder in 1971. The Big Gulp, 7-Eleven, launched in 1976 at 32 ounces, then expanded to 44, 64, and 128 ounces. Restaurants normalized all-you-can-eat buffets. Americans were living inside a food environment that encouraged overeating at every turn. Scientists push harder. Industries push back harder. By 1988, the Surgeon General's report on nutrition and health decisively stated that dietary factors were major contributors to America's leading causes of death. The message could not be clearer. But industries intensified lobbying. Meat groups funded ads claiming that red meat was part of a balanced lifestyle. Dairy companies promoted 3-a-day campaigns to normalize heavy milk consumption. The sugar industry argued that sugar was unfairly demonized. The closer science moved toward eat less, the more fiercely industries fought to maintain eat more. The stage is set for the 1990s. Food wars. As the century closed, science called for reductions, government wavered, industry promoted abundance. Consumers became stuck between health messages and marketing messages. The battle between scientific truth and commercial power was now fully established. The transition from eat more to eat less was not just difficult, it was politically explosive, and this struggle would erupt fully in the early 1990s, leading to the controversy over the food pyramid and the reshaping of American nutrition advice for decades. When the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, began drafting the food pyramid in the late 1980s, the intention was simple: create a visual guide that could help Americans make healthier choices in an era marked by rising chronic disease. What emerged instead was one of the most politically charged food policy conflicts in U.S. history. The struggle between science and politics, between what the nation needed to hear and what powerful food industries wanted the public to hear, shaped every stage of the pyramid's creation. What should have been a straightforward educational tool became a battleground for meat producers, dairy associations, grain lobbies, sugar refiners, and processed food corporations. By the time the food pyramid was released in 1992, it had been revised, pressured, softened, and reshaped so extensively that many of its original scientific intentions were either diluted or removed entirely. To understand the fierce conflicts surrounding the food pyramid, it is necessary to step back into the landscape of American nutrition policy in the late 1980s. Chronic disease had become a national crisis. Heart disease was still the leading cause of death. Obesity rates had been rising steadily since the 1970s. Type 2 diabetes had doubled within a single generation. The scientific community, especially those working in public health nutrition, had reached a broad consensus. The American diet contained too much saturated fat, too much sugar, too many refined grains, too many processed products, and too many calories. The earliest versions of what would become the food pyramid reflected these concerns. In 1988, nutrition specialists within the USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, drafted a simple but revolutionary document known as the Food Guide Pyramid Plan. It was built on a core scientific principle. Foods should be consumed in proportions that align with their known health impacts. The base of the pyramid emphasized whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, nutrient-rich foods associated with lower risks of chronic disease. The upper tiers featured foods to consume sparingly, saturated fats, sweets, oils, and red meat. For the first time in a government nutrition tool, foods high in saturated fat were visually placed at the top, labeled as categories to limit. This hierarchy directly challenged powerful agricultural sectors whose products fell into the eat sparingly tier. As soon as drafts of the pyramid began circulating within USDA offices, the political pressure began. The National Cattlemen's Association, later renamed the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, reacted with particular fury. The pyramid placed beef in a category labeled "use sparingly," implying that beef should not be consumed daily. For an industry that had spent decades promoting beef as an essential component of American meals, the symbolic placement was devastating. Lobbyists warned the USDA that the pyramid would cause irreparable harm to American agriculture. Behind the scenes, the beef industry mobilized allies in Congress, especially representatives from cattle-producing states. Letters poured into the USDA urging the agency to reconsider the pyramid structure. The dairy industry felt similarly threatened. In the draft pyramid, butter, cheese, and whole milk were placed in upper tiers because of their saturated fat content. The National Dairy Council argued fiercely that such placement would mislead the public, claiming that dairy foods had unique nutritional benefits and that emphasizing fat content was an oversimplification. Dairy lobbyists requested changes to the pyramid's visual design, insisting that milk deserved a more prominent and positive placement. They argued that millions of children needed dairy for calcium, and any recommendation suggesting limited intake might harm their health, an argument that conveniently aligned with industry economic interests. The sugar industry's objections were equally intense. The pyramid visually separated fats and sugars into a narrow top tier labeled "use sparingly." For sugar producers, this was unacceptable. The Sugar Association had spent decades shaping public opinion by portraying sugar as innocuous quick energy. They argued that placing sugar at the top of the pyramid unfairly singled out their product and misrepresented scientific evidence. Industry-funded nutritionists submitted reports claiming that sugar was essential for mental performance and that its role in chronic disease was overstated. These arguments were not scientifically sound, but they were politically potent. Meanwhile, the processed food industry, which relied heavily on sugar, salt, refined flour, and inexpensive oils, saw the pyramid as a direct threat. Many packaged foods would be implicitly categorized as items to limit. Snack food companies, cereal manufacturers, and fast food chains all feared potential declines in sales. The Grocery Manufacturers of America, one of the largest industry associations in the country, warned that the pyramid would confuse consumers and unfairly bias eating habits. Their concern was not consumer confusion, but consumer awareness. Faced with this tidal wave of opposition, the USDA took an extraordinary step. It halted the release of the pyramid entirely. In early 1991, USDA officials called a sudden press conference announcing that the pyramid would be delayed indefinitely. They justified the postponement by claiming the pyramid required further testing for consumer comprehension, but insiders later revealed that political pressure was the real cause. Senator Conrad Burns of Montana, a champion of the beef industry, had personally intervened, telling USDA leaders that the pyramid would wreak havoc on cattle markets. His influence, combined with that of other agricultural state legislators, was enough to stop the pyramid in its tracks. Within the USDA, morale among nutrition experts plummeted. Nutritionists who had worked for years on the pyramid saw their work undermined not by science, but by politics. Some internal memos, later released through the Freedom of Information Act, documented the frustration of USDA staff who recognized that scientific recommendations were being compromised. One memo, written by a senior staff member, stated bluntly, "We must balance science with economic realities." It was a revealing admission. The agency tasked with promoting public health was also responsible for protecting agricultural industries, a dual role that created an unavoidable conflict of interest. As the USDA revised the pyramid, changes began to appear. The phrase "used sparingly" was softened, categories were blended, language became less directive. Instead of directly advising Americans to reduce specific foods, the language shifted toward vague suggestions such as choose lean meats or moderate your intake of sugars. These revisions placated industries but weakened the pyramid's scientific clarity. One of the most contentious revisions involved the grain group at the pyramid's base. Scientific evidence supported whole grains, rich in fiber and micronutrients, as the healthiest grain choice. But the nation's grain industry, particularly companies dependent on refined flour, argued that emphasizing whole grains would hurt sales. Their lobbying efforts succeeded. The final pyramid did not distinguish clearly between whole and refined grains. As a result, products like white bread, sugary breakfast, cereals, and refined pasta remained positioned at the very foundation of the pyramid, the foods Americans were encouraged to eat the most of. This single compromise would shape American eating patterns for decades. Despite the compromises, the food pyramid was finally released in 1992. To the public, it appeared as a simple educational tool, colorful, structured, and easy to understand. But beneath its polished surface lay the scars of intense political battles. The visual hierarchy remained, but its meaning had been softened. Americans were told to eat more grains, fruits, and vegetables, but the distinction between whole and refined grains had been eliminated. They were advised to reduce saturated fat, but the wording avoided singling out red meat or full-fat dairy. Sugar's positioning at the top of the pyramid was retained, but the accompanying language was carefully negotiated to avoid alienating industry groups. Reactions were mixed. Scientists lamented the weakened recommendations, arguing that the pyramid failed to address the real drivers of chronic disease. Public health advocates warned that the muddled message would confuse consumers. Meanwhile, industries celebrated. They had successfully protected their products from regulatory condemnation while maintaining the appearance of supporting public health initiatives. In hindsight, The 1991 and 1992 food pyramid conflict revealed a critical truth. Nutrition policy in America was no longer simply a matter of science. It had become a political arena where economic power, industry lobbying, and governmental interests often outweighed scientific consensus. The pyramid's final form reflected not only what Americans needed nutritionally, but what corporations needed economically. The scientific foundation of the pyramid was undeniably strong, but the political forces shaping it were stronger. The result was a nutrition guide that represented compromise rather than clarity. And this battle, far from being an isolated event, would shape every subsequent dietary guideline, every public debate over low-fat versus low-carb, and every controversy over sugar, meat, dairy, and processed foods in the decades to come. The struggle between science and politics had officially become a defining feature of American nutrition, one that would intensify in the years ahead. By the time the food pyramid controversy erupted in the early 1990s, the United States had already spent decades building a political environment in which food industries possessed extraordinary influence. Lobbying was not simply an accessory of the system, it was the system. The moment a scientific recommendation threatened to reduce consumption of a commodity, meat, sugar, dairy, wheat, corn, or processed foods, industry groups activated sophisticated political strategies to protect their market share. What unfolded across the latter half of the 20th century was the construction of a lobbying machine so large, so embedded, and so effective that nutrition policy became, in many respects, an extension of corporate interest. Lobbying in the food sector began in earnest during the 1950s, when agricultural groups recognized that federal subsidies, military procurement, and school lunch programs could dramatically influence national consumption patterns. Organizations like the National Cattlemen's Association, the American Dairy Council, and the National Corn Growers Association established permanent offices in Washington, D.C. to maintain constant communication with lawmakers. Their goal was simple: ensure that government decisions reflected industry priorities. Over time, these associations perfected techniques that made them some of the most powerful actors in U.S. politics. One of the most important tools was the framing of industry goals as aligned with national interests. When the beef industry pushed for favorable regulations, they did not describe their efforts as protecting profits. They framed them as supporting family ranchers, maintaining rural economies, and preserving American tradition. Dairy lobbyists spoke of safeguarding children's health because milk was portrayed as essential for growth. Grain and corn groups emphasized food security, export strength, and America's role as the world's agricultural powerhouse. These narratives resonated deeply in Congress, where rural constituencies held significant political weight. By the 1970s, the food lobbying apparatus had grown so large that it rivaled the pharmaceutical and tobacco industries in influence. When the McGovern Committee proposed the first dietary goals urging Americans to eat less meat, the backlash illustrated the lobbying system's true power. Meat producers mobilized rapidly, contacting congressional offices, threatening economic fallout, and launching public relations campaigns that questioned the scientific integrity of the committee. Within weeks, the committee softened its language. The phrase, "eat less meat," disappeared, replaced with "choose lean meats." This pattern repeated across commodities. When the FDA attempted to regulate sugar labeling in the late 1970s, the Sugar Association launched a multi-million-dollar campaign insisting that sugar was a harmless source of energy. They funded studies designed to cast doubt on research linking sugar to chronic disease. They sponsored advertisements claiming that sugar is nature's energy booster. Their influence extended deep into the scientific community. One infamous case involved a 1967 review published in the New England Journal of Medicine that downplayed sugar's role in heart disease while emphasizing the dangers of dietary fat. It later emerged that the review had been funded secretly by sugar interests. Lobbying extended far beyond scientific debates. Food companies invested heavily in political campaigns, ensuring a steady supply of sympathetic lawmakers. They provided talking points to legislators during committee hearings. They held private dinners with regulatory officials. They created political action committees, or PACs, that funneled money into re-election efforts. For every attempt to regulate unhealthy ingredients, salt, sugar, saturated fat, an industry group was ready with counter-arguments, counter-studies, and immense political pressure. Perhaps the most striking example of lobbying power occurred during debates over agricultural subsidies. Beginning with the 1973 Farm Bill, the U.S. government shifted from policies designed to stabilize prices to policies designed to maximize production, especially of corn. Influential lobbyists from seed companies, fertilizer manufacturers, meat packers, and processed food conglomerates pushed for a system that rewarded high yield. The result was a dramatic rise in subsidized corn production, which in turn fueled the growth of corn syrup, feedlot livestock production, and low-cost processed foods. These economic decisions reshaped the American diet more profoundly than any scientific recommendation ever could. Even health organizations were not immune to lobbying influence. Industry groups routinely partnered with major institutions such as the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. These partnerships took the form of sponsorships, research grants, conference funding, and educational materials. In return, industries gained the prestige of scientific legitimacy and access to captive professional audiences. By the 1990s, the lobbying structure was so deeply entrenched that meaningful nutrition reform became nearly impossible without industry approval. Congressional hearings on nutrition routinely featured representatives from meat, dairy, sugar, grain, and beverage industries. Consumer advocacy groups and public health scientists were often outnumbered, outspent, and overshadowed. Nutrition policy had become a political negotiation rather than a scientific one. The greatest irony was that the very institutions tasked with safeguarding public health, USDA, FDA, and HHS, were forced to operate in a political environment shaped by industries whose profits depended on increased consumption of foods linked to chronic disease. This contradiction lay at the heart of the American food system, ensuring that whenever science said eat less, politics would say not so fast. If lobbying Congress and regulatory agencies was the first line of defense for the food industry, the second, and arguably more subtle, strategy was the co-optation of nutrition professionals. Industry understood early on that controlling science meant controlling the narrative. If experts could be influenced, the public could be reassured, and policymakers could be persuaded that controversial products were safe, misunderstood, or unfairly criticized. Over decades, food companies perfected a complex web of sponsorships, partnerships, grants, and public relations strategies that blurred the line between independent scientific research and corporate marketing. The co-optation of nutrition professionals operated through several mechanisms. The most visible was the funding of scientific research. Companies provided grants to university researchers to study questions that were framed in ways beneficial to the sponsor. A study funded by a sugar company rarely asked whether sugar caused chronic disease. Instead, it might explore whether physical inactivity was a more significant factor in obesity. A dairy-funded study might examine whether cheese consumption improved calcium absorption, ignoring its saturated fat content. These studies were not necessarily fraudulent. They were simply designed to produce answers that aligned with corporate goals. One famous case involved the soft drink industry. In the early 2000s, beverage companies quietly funded studies claiming that sugary drinks were not uniquely linked to obesity when compared to other caloric sources. These studies were published in reputable journals, but were later found to have been framed with methodological choices that minimized the observed effects of sugar-sweetened beverages. Meanwhile, independent researchers consistently found strong associations between sugary drink consumption and weight gain, diabetes, and metabolic disorders. The dairy industry also mastered the art of shaping science in its favor. Through organizations such as Dairy Management, Inc., the industry funded hundreds of studies emphasizing the health benefits of calcium while downplaying the risks of saturated fat. Dairy-funded researchers published papers suggesting that cheese could be part of a weight loss diet because its protein increased satiety. Studies that were widely criticized for methodological flaws and selective interpretation. Yet these findings influenced nutrition guidelines and were cited by health organizations in their educational materials. Perhaps the most influential example of industry co-optation involved the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, A&D, the largest professional organization of dietitians in the United States. For decades, and accepted sponsorships from major food corporations including Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Kraft, Hershey, General Mills, and the National Dairy Council. These partnerships gave companies direct access to professionals responsible for providing dietary advice to millions of Americans. At conferences, registered dietitians attended workshops sponsored by processed food companies, participated in product tastings, and received educational materials crafted by corporate marketing departments posing as nutrition science. Industry influence extended beyond research and professional organizations into the realm of public messaging. Food companies hired well-known scientists as paid consultants, asking them to speak to the media, testify before Congress, or appear in advertisements. These experts were often presented as independent voices even when their statements aligned closely with industry goals. For example, during the height of the low-fat craze in the 1980s and 1990s, scientists funded by processed food manufacturers publicly promoted low-fat cookies, snacks, and desserts as healthy alternatives, framing them as solutions to the obesity epidemic. This helped create a boom in fat-free products, many of which contained more sugar and calories than the original versions. Another subtle method of co-optation involved educational curricula. Food companies produced nutrition education materials for schools, often presented as neutral resources despite clear marketing content. The dairy industry distributed textbooks claiming milk was essential for strong bones at all ages. The beef industry created lesson plans suggesting that vegetarians lacked essential nutrients. Cereal companies developed classroom posters encouraging children to start every day with a healthy, high-energy breakfast, featuring sugary cereals marketed as nutritious. These tactics were effective because they targeted the most trusted voices in nutrition: doctors, researchers, dietitians, and teachers. When professionals echoed industry messages, the public accepted them as authoritative. Over time, the boundaries between corporate influence and scientific independence blurred so deeply that many consumers, and even many policymakers, struggled to distinguish evidence-based guidance from sponsored opinion. The consequences of this co-optation were far-reaching. For decades, scientific debates about fat, sugar, salt, processed foods, and supplements were distorted by the weight of industry-funded research. Public confusion grew. Nutrition guidelines became politically and economically compromised, and the health of Americans suffered as mixed messages allowed unhealthy food environments to flourish. The co-optation of experts enabled industry to achieve what direct lobbying alone could not. Shaping the very foundation of nutritional knowledge, it ensured that scientific consensus could be delayed, diluted, or redirected. And it allowed the food industry to maintain the appearance of scientific legitimacy, even as rising rates of chronic disease pointed to deep flaws in the American diet. As the 20th century progressed and public health science increasingly implicated processed foods, sugars, fats, and additives in chronic disease, the food industry realized that direct confrontation with critics was unsustainable. Lobbying could block regulations and stall policy change, but it could not rebuild trust or prevent public skepticism from rising. To secure long-term influence, the industry needed a strategy that worked not through political force, but through social legitimacy. The solution was soft power, the systematic cultivation of goodwill, strategic partnerships, and institutional alliances designed to neutralize critics before opposition could form. The cornerstone of this strategy was the cultivation of relationships with respected health organizations. Beginning in the 1970s, food companies learned that aligning their brands with institutions like the American Heart Association, AHA, American Diabetes Association, ADA, American Academy of Pediatrics, AAP, and even the World Health Organization, WHO, could dramatically reshape public perception. By sponsoring conferences, funding educational initiatives, and providing grants for community health programs, companies embedded themselves within the very institutions responsible for protecting public health. One of the earliest and most striking examples was the relationship between the AHA and the food industry. In the 1980s, several major food corporations, including cereals, dairy producers, and margarine manufacturers, donated substantial funds to the AHA. In return, many of their products qualified for the association's influential heart check symbol, often based on narrow nutrient criteria rather than holistic dietary impact. Some sugary breakfast cereals, low-fat processed foods, and margarine brands high in trans fats received endorsements simply because they met specific thresholds for saturated fat and cholesterol. Critics pointed out the contradiction. Products contributing to obesity and diabetes carried symbols associated with heart health. But because these endorsements came from a trusted health organization, consumers accepted them unquestioningly. The dairy industry perfected a similar strategy. Through Dairy Management Inc. and the National Dairy Council, the industry formed partnerships with the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and pediatric associations. Educational booklets, meal planning guides, and classroom posters were distributed nationwide, all positioning milk and cheese as essential components of a healthy diet. These materials were often presented as neutral science, yet they conveniently emphasized dairy's benefits while ignoring concerns about saturated fat. Dietitians attending national conferences were greeted by industry-sponsored workshops, teaching them to recommend dairy products as part of weight loss regimens, despite contradictory evidence from independent research. The soft drink industry also mastered the art of strategic friendship. Coca-Cola and PepsiCo joined public health conversations by sponsoring youth sports programs, exercise initiatives, and obesity prevention campaigns that emphasized physical activity rather than dietary change. This strategy, known in academic literature as energy balance framing, shifted blame for obesity from sugary beverages to lack of exercise. Beverage companies also funded influential researchers who published papers claiming there was no unique link between soft drinks and obesity once total caloric intake was considered. These studies, though methodologically flawed, provided a veneer of scientific legitimacy that the industry used to defend its products. Beyond health organizations, food corporations invested in relationships with community groups, minority associations, and local governments. Fast food companies sponsored scholarships for African American and Latino students, funded youth programs, and provided meals for community events. These efforts created goodwill in communities disproportionately affected by diet-related illnesses. Critics argued that such sponsorships diverted attention from the health consequences of these companies' products, especially in areas where fast food chains were clustered in low-income neighborhoods. Universities also became key allies. Endowed chairs, research labs, nutrition centers, and academic conferences were funded by industry dollars. A professor studying the role of processed foods in obesity might simultaneously receive funding from a cereal manufacturer. Even when researchers remained objective, the perception of bias weakened public trust in nutrition science. And when researchers did produce findings favorable to their sponsors, companies promoted these results aggressively through press releases and advertising campaigns. Perhaps the most subtle form of soft power was the food industry's embrace of corporate social responsibility, CSR. Beginning in the 1990s, companies launched initiatives to portray themselves as partners in health solutions rather than contributors to the problem. Soft drink companies introduced smaller portion sizes while continuing to market large ones. Snack manufacturers added baked or low-fat product lines that were promoted as healthier alternatives, even when highly processed. Fast food restaurants added salads and fruit bowls to their menus, not to reduce sales of burgers and fries, but to soften criticism and appeal to health-conscious consumers. This complex ecosystem of sponsorships, donations, partnerships, and pseudoscientific alliances succeeded in blunting criticism. Health organizations softened their tone. Professional societies hesitated to challenge the companies funding their conferences. University researchers avoided antagonizing sponsors whose money supported their labs. These efforts did not simply buy silence, they bought legitimacy. By winning friends among the very institutions meant to hold them accountable, the food industry insulated itself from scrutiny. In the end, soft power proved just as important as lobbying. Whereas lobbying fought battles in Congress, soft power shaped public perception, scientific debate, and institutional alignment. Together, they formed a robust shield, ensuring that when science warned Americans to eat less, industry influence could render the message quiet, complicated, or completely ineffective. If soft power was the velvet glove of the food industry, its hardball tactics were the iron fist. When persuasion failed, when scientists, regulators, journalists, or activists threatened the industry's most profitable products, companies deployed far more aggressive strategies. These ranged from legal intimidation to disinformation campaigns, from political manipulation to covert funding of front groups that appeared independent but operated in industry interests. This chapter examines how far the food industry was willing to go when its profits were at stake. Legal intimidation became a central tactic beginning in the 1970s, when processed food companies and commodity groups discovered that lawsuits could silence critics just as effectively as lobbying. A notable early example involved beef producers suing television stations that aired investigative reports on the safety of feedlot practices. The beef industry also targeted scientists who criticized saturated fat, threatening defamation claims unless they retracted or softened their statements. Even when cases did not proceed to trial, the threat of litigation created a chilling effect. Researchers learned that challenging powerful food interests could jeopardize their careers. Sugar companies likewise embraced aggressive tactics. When the World Health Organization, WHO, proposed guidelines in 2003 recommending that sugar should constitute no more than 10% of daily caloric intake, the Sugar Association and major soda manufacturers launched a political offensive. They lobbied the U.S. government to withhold funding from WHO, arguing that the guidelines were unscientific. The pressure was so severe that WHO leadership considered delaying the report. Though the guidelines ultimately survived, the episode demonstrated the willingness of industry to use geopolitical leverage to suppress public health recommendations. The dairy industry's hardball tactics surfaced most vividly in the 1990s, when dairy producers pushed for stringent restrictions on the labeling of plant-based alternatives. They argued that terms like soy milk and almond milk misled consumers, despite the fact that these products had been labeled this way for decades. Through legal threats and regulatory petitions, dairy lobbyists sought to force plant-based products to use names like soy beverage, which they believed would reduce consumer appeal. The fight continues today, illustrating the industry's long-term strategy of using legal pressure to protect its dominance. Perhaps the most extreme example of hardball tactics came from fast food and processed food companies confronting activists who highlighted the health risks of their products. In the late 1990s, McDonald's filed a libel suit in the United Kingdom against two environmental activists who criticized the company's labor and food practices. The case, known as the McLibel trial, became the longest civil case in British history. Although McDonald's ultimately won a partial judgment, the trial revealed numerous internal documents showing how aggressively the company worked to suppress criticism. Rather than deterring activists, the trial backfired internationally, damaging McDonald's reputation and illustrating the risks of overreaching legal aggression. Beyond the courtroom, the food industry utilized covert strategies that blurred ethical boundaries. One common tactic was the creation of front groups, organizations that appeared independent but were secretly funded by industry. For example, the Center for Consumer Freedom, CCF, founded in the 1990s, portrayed itself as a consumer advocacy group fighting food policing and nutrition hysteria. In reality, it was funded by restaurant chains, meat producers, and beverage companies. CCF attacked public health researchers, accused nutritionists of promoting food fear, and launched media campaigns suggesting that concerns over obesity and sugar were exaggerated. Another hardball tactic involved the manipulation of science through selective publication. Industry-funded studies with negative findings were quietly shelved, while favorable results were publicized widely. This practice distorted scientific literature, creating the illusion of consensus where none existed. Researchers learned that challenging industry-funded narratives could lead to funding withdrawal, career stagnation, or professional isolation. For young scientists, The risks were often too great. Political manipulation also played a crucial role. Food companies supported candidates who opposed regulatory oversight and targeted policymakers who advanced aggressive public health measures. During debates over trans fat regulation in the early 2000s, margarine and processed food manufacturers used political pressure to delay FDA action for years, even though scientists had already established strong links between trans fats and heart disease. When New York City attempted to regulate restaurant use of trans fats in the mid-2000s, industry groups orchestrated a public relations campaign claiming the bans were an assault on personal freedom. What made these hardball tactics particularly effective was the industry's willingness to operate on multiple fronts simultaneously. A scientist raising concerns about sugar could find themselves targeted by lobbyists, criticized by industry-sponsored researchers, attacked by front groups, and threatened legally, all at the same time. This multi-pronged approach made resistance costly, stressful, and often isolating. These tactics had profound public health consequences. They delayed recognition of the dangers of trans fats by decades. They slowed progress on sugar reduction. They sowed confusion about dietary fat. They protected processed foods from meaningful regulation. And they ensured that when science warned Americans to eat less of certain foods, the industry's response, whether subtle or aggressive, would shape public perception more than scientific consensus. The food industry did not merely respond to criticism. It actively shaped the environment in which criticism occurred. Through friendship and intimidation, partnership and pressure, the industry created a system in which scientific truth had to fight for traction against powerful economic interests.